Cover stories are one of the most easily overlooked treasure troves of information for any One Piece fan, and this is largely due to the fact that most of them never got animated, as well as how easy it can be for even the most avid manga readers to gloss over them in order to get to the meat of the chapter. But the cover story arcs are as canon as the manga itself, and while some of them are just simply fun or comedic, most of them act as a great way for Oda to expand the world building of One Piece even further by introducing new and exciting plot lines that run roughly concurrent with the story. And this often provides a massive boost when it comes to making theories as well, because we've seen everything from Enel going to the moon and meeting space pirates, to Jinbe finding a poneglyph from underwater ruins, all the way to Shushu getting a new pet food store, to Hatchan finding a devil fruit in an underwater refrigerator. So that's why I wanted to make this video and go through every single cover story in detail, as well as provide some insight into how they went on to impact the main story, and how Oda might tie up some of the loose ends that still remain. But without further ado, let's get into it. So let's start at the very beginning with the first cover story we ever got, Buggy's Crew Adventure Chronicles, which kicks off fresh after Buggy was defeated by Luffy in Orangetown. And you'll notice that this is a very common theme amongst all the cover stories, where most of them, especially early on, follow the events of an enemy after losing to the Straw Hats, so we can then see how they got to the point they're at when they re-enter the story later on. And this is one of the few cover stories that did get animated, so I think there's a good chance a lot of you are going to remember this one. But this cover story begins with Buggy rowing away from some fish, as well as Koby and Moji running from the almighty Shushu. So Mini Buggy then finds himself on a new island and tries to eat a baby bird, who goes on to find its mother, who decides to eat him instead on a plate with a picnic table and everything. But then she spat him out because clowns taste terrible, and he starts flying away to the next island, which are basically the same kind of shenanigans that you would expect Luffy to get into, especially because the island that Buggy lands on is none other than Gaimon's Island, the Island of Rare Animals, which is a place that Luffy had visited not that long before this chapter came out. So naturally, Mini Buggy starts off by fighting Gaimon, but they quickly put aside their differences and party together by accepting the fact that all of them are at least a little bit strange. So Buggy builds a makeshift raft somehow and leaves his newfound friends, but in typical Buggy fashion, it's quickly destroyed by a giant crab anyways, who looks almost identical to the moving crab named Hasami that we meet in Gedatsu's cover story, by the way, but we'll talk about him more later in the video. And then Buggy actually gets saved from this crab by none other than the new, slimmed down Alvida. They then learn that they're both after Luffy, so they make an alliance with one another to take him down. But since the other part of the crew isn't even aware that Buggy's still alive, we next see Moji and Koby holding a funeral for Buggy, and then preparing to fight each other for the right to become the next captain, where their battle lasts for over 12 hours. We also see Richie sleeping off to the side here, dreaming of himself becoming the captain, which then causes him to get up and defeat both Koby and Moji in his sleep, while dreaming of beating some kind of dragon. And there's been a lot of fun theories lately about this silhouetted dragon, especially with the importance of dreams in One Piece, and even the idea that nightmares can come to life, as we saw in Elbaf. But nonetheless, this then leads to the formation of everybody's favorite pirate crew, the Richie Pirates, who may hold the title for the shortest lived pirate crew of all time, because then the Kumate tribe, the natives from the island, ran up and defeated them in no time. And these guys are kind of interesting because their face paint and their island shape both resemble bear paws, just like the ones we see with Kuma and his paw fruit, and that's due to the fact that they have Kuma right in their name, which means bear in Japanese, and I think that's pretty cool. But thankfully, Buggy and Alvida then show up to save the day, where they find the rest of the so-called Richie pirates being cooked alive to create Richie Crew's red wine stew. I'm not sure why people like the Kumate tribe or Brule or Kaido want to keep trying to cook people alive, but I guess Oda's just a fan of that kind of thing. So then we see Buggy activate his missing body parts that he's been looking for all along, and defeats the rest of the Kumate tribe, meaning that the Buggy crew is finally reunited. As I mentioned at the start, this cover story basically acted as Oda's way of explaining how Buggy got from point A, which is being defeated at Orangetown, all the way to point B, which is his his appearance in Logtown with Alvida. And it's such a smart thing to add in here, is almost like a parallel story with what the Straw Hats are doing, to then make the events in Logtown feel even more legitimate and well structured. But our next cover story is the Diary of Koby Meppo, which gives us some insight into the training that Koby and Helmeppo went through once they joined the Marines. And just like the Buggy cover story, this is one of the very few that also got animated, so I think there's a good chance that a lot of this is going to ring a bell as well. But we kick this all off with these two fellas starting their careers as chore boys. And right away you can see that Koby's taking things a lot more seriously than Helmeppo, whether it's mopping the floor or even cleaning clothes, which I would have loved if Suru made an appearance here since she has the wash fruit, but I digress. And then we get to see them eating lunch with Rika, the same girl who fed Zoro when we first met him. We also have Helmeppo off to the side here hammering a nail into a Luffy voodoo doll, which is a little bit strange, but maybe on par for someone like Helmeppo. And then we see them all at night where everyone's sleeping, except for Koby, who's still up studying. And I really love how what Koby's doing here parallels what we've learned more recently from his training with Garp. Like, we learned that even after Garp's daily training, Koby would go fight the battleship bags during the night. That tenacity is what makes Koby so special, and we see it exemplified here even when he was in charge of more basic tasks. But then their ship is given the duty of transporting none other than Axe Hand Morgan. And we even see Helmeppo worrying about the death penalty, because even though Axe Hand Morgan's a terrible guy, that still is his dad and everything. But then Garp pulls up as they're meant to transfer Morgan's over to him, and we even see Bogard for the very first time. But then, shockingly, Morgan's is able to get an attack in and draw blood on the legendary hero Monkey D. Garp. Now, we learn later that this is supposedly because Garp fell asleep, which we know he tends to do sometimes, but this still feels pretty weird, I think. I mean, we've heard that people like Whitebeard would even wake up in his sleep to stop Ace from attacking him, so maybe this scene is just a victim of occurring really early on before Oda had all of his power levels figured out. But with how strong we've come to know Garp is, it still feels kind of shocking, especially because afterward, Morgan's breaks his chains somehow and then grabs his own son Helmeppo as a hostage. So Morgan's then makes an escape with Helmeppo and the Marines ready the cannons. But Koby jumps in to stop them since his friend would be in harm's way. And I mean literally jumps in, like directly in front of the cannon, which again, does a lot to tell us what Koby's character is all about, even in just such a short span. He's not willing to sacrifice his friend, and it's almost like a warm-up for Marineford, where he later stood up to Akainu as he wanted the war to stop and for all the people to stop dying. So Bogard jumps in, finally, and cuts up Koby's guns, and then even Garp wakes up and just breaks the cannon. But then, we get a Helmeppo moment, where he stands up to his own father and swims his way back to the main ship. Koby and Helmeppo then apologize for what they've done, and Garp responds by saying he will take those two under his wing. Now, in the anime, Koby actually swims over as well and helps Helmeppo escape his dad, but in the manga, Helmeppo simply stands up for himself and leaves all on his own. And I much prefer the manga version because Helmeppo needs to get his own moments, you know? Even at Hachinosu, he was just setting screens for Koby the whole time, so even though it's small, I definitely prefer Koby not getting involved here. And looking back on this, I think it's so cool that what made these two worthy in the eyes of Garp wasn't their strength or their abilities, but instead it was their bravery. He knew that he could whip them into shape later, as we saw, but Helmeppo, and especially Koby, have the most important thing that he can't really teach. So then we see Koby and Helmeppo are off to Marine HQ, where they're yet again back to doing chores, but they also get special training after dark so they can start beefing up. And we also get a cool glimpse of Rika back at Shellstown being upset about the departure of her friends, which I really like because it shows the kind of connection that they've built over the last few weeks or however long this has been. And then the cover story ends with Bogard continuing their training even further. And for our next cover story, we have Jango's Dance Paradise, which shows us how he went all the way from being a pirate in Syrup Village to eventually becoming a Marine. And this is also our first cover story that was never animated, unless you count us seeing Mirabal Island in a short special that they did for the Clockwork Island Adventure movie. But this one begins with Jango waking up in the forest right after the events of Syrup Village. He then sees the remnants of his crew leave, so he decides to go get some food in town until Onion finds him, so then the Usopp Defense Force chases him off the island, and he skedaddles away until he passes our good old friend Axe Hand Morgan. And you'll remember that these two have a really important past, right? With Jango hypnotizing him to say that he defeated Kuro, so it's probably for the best for Jango that Morgans was passed out here. I believe this is also the last time we've seen Morgan in the canon manga as well. In the anime, he did mention that he wanted to begin a Morgan Empire, whatever that means, so I guess he's been busy trying to do that. But next, we get to see that Kaya's doing better now, and she's training to become a doctor now, which is great to see. But then we're right back to our boy Jango arriving at Mirror Ball Island, and it turns out the Marines are looking for him, so of course Jango puts on a disguise, and we see his real eyes, which are heart-shaped, just like his glasses. But then he comes across a dance contest that he can't resist, since it is Mirror Ball Island, I guess, which ends up lasting 3 whole chapters before Jango gets finally crowned the winner. He then chooses to share a drink with his opponent, who, if you haven't noticed by now, ends up being the Marine Full Body, who is now like Jango's best friend in the story, and here we are witnessing the beginnings of that. But then Captain Eureka and the Tulip Pirates attack, and these guys are probably why everyone makes fun of the East Blue. But this does provide Jango with a chance to escape since the Marines were busy, but the Tulip Pirates take a girl hostage and get the upper hand. So this brings Jango back, where he and Full Body do this tag team dance attack thing, and they defeat all those pirates. But since Jango is a wanted man after all, Full Body has to take him in, where Jango is then sentenced to hanging. So then Full Body does the dance of objection, which gets the entire courtroom to start dancing together, which apparently earned Jango's freedom, I guess, at least at the expense of Full Body also getting a demotion. So then they have to say goodbye, and we get this typical can't show that we're friends because you're a pirate trope that Oda loves to do, kind of like we saw with Koby and Luffy before this, as well as Vivi after this. So Jango even tries to hypnotize Full Body to just forget about all of this, until Hina strolls by and distracts all of them. So then, just like Koby and Helmeppo before this, we see Jango and Full Body serving as chore boys in the Marines, working their way up the ranks where they still are today. So next up, we have Hatchan's Seafloor Stroll, where we see how Hatchan got freed and then in control of his takoyaki ship, which we later saw during Sabaody. And this is another one that never got animated, but it begins with Hatchan first breaking free from imprisonment, then deciding to head home and helping out a panda shark along the way, and then said panda shark feeds Hatchan out of his refrigerator. But this isn't just any fridge, because make sure you pay attention to what's hiding in the freezer, because this man just found a devil fruit. I don't think we've ever figured out what that fruit is, or if we have any reason to believe it's moved since then, and I kind of wonder if this was a normal fruit when it was first put in there, but maybe someone drowned nearby, so it reincarnated as a devil fruit, sorta like we saw during Punk Hazard. But if you guys have any other theories on what this fruit might be, make sure you let me know down below. But next we see Hatchan find a starving man and feed him, and then get a ring in return. So then he returns the ring to the Goldfish Princess, who gives him a golden trident in return, which he then uses to save a sea boar who spits out none other than Kami and Papag. This is what started their friendship that we obviously got to see more of during Sabaody. But then the Macro Fishmen pirates show up, and Hatchan literally trades Kami away for a takoyaki map, which will lead him to the legendary takoyaki recipe. And I gotta say, given what we saw during Sabaody, this feels a little bit out of character. And I know he was on Arlong's crew before, so he's definitely done some messed up stuff, but it still feels pretty odd since this is another fishman and everything. Especially given that we later learned Macro is known as the mermaid seller, but we'll roll with it, because Hatchan apparently thinks he can win over some octopus girl with this new recipe. But when he gets to the spot on the map, he comes to find out that there is no recipe, so Hatchan goes and gets his revenge. Not for taking his friend to be sold into presumed slavery, mind you, but for tricking him about the recipe. And the irony of that is that they didn't even trick him. It was just inside the octopus that Hatchan beat up down there. So now that he's equipped with the special sauce, some treasure, and a giant octopus, he goes off to win over this girl, who actually turns out to be kind of a piece of trash because she's making fun of a starving village that had a sunken ship land on them. But Hatchan, finally remembering that he's a good person, notices the starving people and instead rushes to trade all his treasure for ingredients, and thus he finally gets to start his takoyaki stand. And then after serving everybody, Hatchan says that he wants to save the last box for She Who Is For the Streets, but the elder of the village shows up at the last second. So Hatchan then has to decide who he's gonna give the food to. And of course, our boy does the right thing and gives it to the elder instead. And it's a good thing he did, because the village decided to pay it forward and build him an entire ship, which leads to the grand opening of Takoyaki 8, which is the very same ship we see the crew eating on during Sabaody in chapter 496. Even though this is a pretty small addition, I think it's so interesting that Oda essentially gave this ship an entire backstory when he really didn't have to do that. But because he did, it adds to that really deep world building that we've all come to appreciate in One Piece. But next on our list is Wapol's Omnivorous Hurrah. This is where we see Wapol go from losing to Luffy in Drum Kingdom to becoming the king of Black Drum Kingdom. And interestingly, this one did get animated, but it was a really quick summary which came out 600 episodes after the chapters for it were released. Because instead, what they wanted to do was pair it with Wapol's return in the post-time skip, which honestly makes sense because people would probably need a recap of what happened anyhow. But this whole thing starts off with Wapol eating everything in his path on the island that he landed on after losing to Luffy. We then see him turn into a tree, a lamp, and a bench, then he eats someone's home, and then finally someone comes to arrest this psychopath, but of course, he runs away, which we know he's good at because he even got away from the Gorosei Emu and CP0, and this ends up leaving Wapol destitute, even acknowledging that he's no longer a king. So then this vagabond starts selling matches and eating scrap metal under the bridge, which actually turns into some interesting toys that the kids like playing with. He then starts selling them and getting a bigger and bigger shop, just like we're progressing in Animal Crossing with Nook's Cranny, and a scientist even does a study on these toys and finds that they're made of a special alloy now named Wapo metal. And Wapo metal is extremely important. This is actually what Frankie created the General Frankie out of, because on top of it being very durable, it's also a memory alloy, which lets him change back into pre-configured shapes, which is how Frankie's easily able to transform between Frankie Shogun, or the Brachio tank, or the motorcycle, and so forth. Frankie also made a comment about how Vegapunk's dream was finally realized with this metal, and I was really hoping we'd get some exposition on that in Egghead, but sadly we didn't get a whole lot of Frankie Vegapunk talk at all, and it seems the Germa raid suits also take advantage of similar technology, since they also use memory armor, as Paraspero once told us, which we kinda saw on display with Sanji vs. Queen already, when he popped right back into his normal self after getting all mangled. Now this isn't from Wapo metal, since Germa was around well before Wapo metal ever hit the market, but the memory aspect is still pretty interesting. So anyway, we next get to see the final evolution of Wapol's toy store, as well as the Baku Baku factory, and the creation of the Wapol Corporation. And with this newfound wealth, Wapol manages to marry Miss Freaking Universe, and somehow this man has made his way back to the top, which is also what let him join the Reverie later on. This is honestly one of the most consequential cover stories because not only is Wapo metal incredibly relevant, but he wouldn't have even had the chance to save Vivi at the Reverie if he didn't get recognized as the king of Black Drum due to all of this. So I think this is yet another masterful way of Oda bringing a villain back in a meaningful way, but making it feel very realistic thanks to the cover story. But now we're moving on to the next cover story, which is Ace's Great Blackbeard Search. And as the name implies, this shows us where Ace visited while looking for Blackbeard so he could get revenge for what happened to Thatch. And we start off with Ace dine and dashing from a restaurant called Pasta Lake, and you'll notice that Ace is also in the Nika pose back there, and this was obviously well before we ever learned who Nika was, but this did come out very close to the climax of Skypiea, and only 25 chapters before we got this panel with Luffy in the Nika pose celebrating with everybody, so I definitely think Nika was on Oda's mind around this time. But then we see Ace continue his search, even asking people around town for information, all while the pasta chef is still in hot pursuit since Ace didn't pay his bill. And then Ace actually finds Blackbeard, except it's the wrong one, because it's Dr. Blackbeard. So this gets Ace thrown into the river, which is bad because he can't swim because he does have a devil fruit, so he gets saved by a farm girl further downstream, who ends up being Moda the milkmaid. You might remember her from when Bello Betty stopped at Lelucia, because Moda was the girl that fought back versus Pinkbeard, and who is now with the revolutionaries at Kamabaka Kingdom. And so this would obviously then mean that the island Ace has been on the whole time is Lelucia, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. And I kinda wonder how Luffy's gonna feel when he finds out it wasn't just any old island that got deleted, but one with Ace's friends on it, and one that Imu was attacking specifically to get Sabo. So both of them are tied to this island, which I think is interesting. But then Moda asks Ace to deliver a letter for her for all that she did for him, which he of course obliges. And it then takes him over to the Marine G2 base, where we almost get like a G8 arc, except it's for Ace this time instead of the Straw Hats in the filler. So Ace then puts on a disguise and infiltrates the base, where he immediately makes a detour escort over to the cafeteria, of course, and then he builds onto that strong start by knocking out a Marine who talked trash about Whitebeard, which is honestly kind of cool. So he then somehow slips on a commander's outfit and sneaks into a meeting where the coffee apparently tastes terrible, including in the opinion of Vice Admiral Comil, who we also saw during Marineford, by the way. At which point an intelligence ship arrives and spontaneously catches on fire due to some other pirates. This causes Ace to jump in and save the day because he does have fire powers, except it ruins his disguise because he was still on fire when he came back but wasn't really affected by it. So while he still has a chance, he delivers Mota's letter to Comil, which was essentially just asking if they wanted any milk. And in the midst of this, Ace was also able to sneak away some information on Blackbeard, since it was an intelligence ship after all, which is likely what helped him find Teach on Bonaro Island. But then at the tail end of the cover story here, we see the Marines' food catering ship pull up to Lulusia, because that's where Mota's parents work. Her letter was almost like a trick to get them to come home, because she knew that they would be the ones to pick up the milk. And this ties back to what we saw earlier with the coffee, because this milk helps the coffee taste better. So overall, this was kind of a short and sweet cover story, but as with a lot of Ace's adventures, like when he met Tama, or Yamato, or Little Oars Jr., or even what we learned from the Ace novels, I have a feeling that some of these moments are going to have a role later as well, even if it's just like Mota and Luffy connecting over their love for Ace, like Tama and Yamato did. Next on our list is Gedatsu's accidental Blue Sea life, which shows us what Gedatsu went through after losing the chopper and falling down from Skypiea. And this cover story holds a very special place in my heart, because this is what helped birth my Pluton is a mole theory, which is still probably my all-time favorite, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself already, because where this all begins is with Gedatsu falling down into a place called Ukari Island, which is an island that will eventually be filled with hot springs due to the dream of this random dude with a pickaxe. So Gedatsu explains to him that his goal is to become the chief of the Blue Sea, but in order for him to get by for the time being, he has to help out this pickaxe guy. But when Gedatsu tries to, we actually see that he's struggling to breathe, which is kind of an inversion of the effect that we've seen on people like the Straw Hats or the Shandians when they suddenly went up into the sky. But then next we get to see Gedatsu continue his weird and completely unnecessary antics by not even being able to eat because he forgot to open his mouth, and he doesn't blink for some reason, until one day he's digging as he usually does and hits a mysterious creature of some kind, which is of course the boss of the earth himself, who is a giant mole. This guy was the basis of my original Pluton theory, since he's wearing a hat with Mount Fuji on it, which we know is in Wano, and Pluton is right underneath that mountain, underneath something that they call the Mole Port, by the way. So I think this is yet another example of the really random types of things that you can find in cover stories that can lead to tons and tons of brand new theories. But then we actually see Gedatsu fight this mole in a battle of what they call the Dirt Boss versus the Sky Boss, which I think could be a subtle parallel to a few things, mainly the four gods that we met in Skypiea: the Earth God, Sun God, Forest God, and Rain God, because we also meet a forest boss here in a few pages, and remember, Gedatsu is from Skypiea after all, so it would make some sense if Oda had a little foreshadowing here with him. But regardless, for now what Gedatsu decides to do is alter that mole's helmet and start digging underground, where they finally unearth their first hot spring. This then brings out the forest boss, who Gedatsu also defeats no problem, and then they just keep digging and digging and digging until they end up in Alabasta. And we even see Koza walking by, which is just pretty awesome. I've always been a big fan of him. But it turns out that Goro, the pickaxe guy that Gedatsu's been hanging out with, is Old Man Toto's younger brother and Koza's uncle. Even the One Piece world is smaller than you think. And I think it's pretty awesome that Goro was looking for hot springs, because you'll remember during the Alabasta arc, Toto was digging for water as well, which ended up being a pretty sentimental moment, I would argue. So obviously this whole finding water thing runs in the family. But then what they end up doing is turning that tunnel that the mole made into an actual route for tourists to use, so they can also visit the hot springs. And in a lot safer way than normal, right? No need to go sail on the open ocean with crazy weather and pirates around and such. And the thing that took them from one island to another was that crab named Hisami, the one who looks pretty similar to the one Alvida and Buggy faced off from earlier. So then Vivi and her entourage pull up and make a visit to Gedatsu, and they decide to make use of the hot springs themselves, where we also see Gedatsu being called a boss of the Blue Sea, which was kind of his dream originally, right? Maybe he wanted to be a bigger boss than this, but still. Or more specifically, what they actually call him is Bathman Master Gedatsu. I bet Sanji wouldn't mind that name. And then this whole thing ends with us getting to see a layout of the entire Ukari Island complex that he and Goro created, which started out as nothing more than a bunch of holes in the ground. This cover story, maybe more than any other, exemplifies why reading cover stories is really important. Because Gedatsu is the type of character who would normally be on nobody's radar, but for some reason, Oda packed his cover story with so many little things that will probably come into play later. I mean, the dude met Vivi. Maybe she's gonna mention him when she finally returns to the crew. And speaking of Vivi, our next cover story is actually about her former employers, and this one's called Miss Goldenweek's Meet Baroque Works. This is another cover story that I brought up on this channel a few times because, much like Gedatsu's, it's a cover story packed with little tidbits that might carry weight later on. Especially now during Elbaf, because we met Miss Goldenweek on the same island that we met Dorian Brogy, which is exactly where this cover story begins, where Miss Goldenweek is staying in Mr. Three's wax house until one day she gets the paper and sees that all of her friends have been captured, which this is also the first time she's seeing many of their faces since their organization was so secretive, and I find that really interesting, because she still immediately decided to pack up her bags so she could go look for them. This shows that she really cared about her nakama like any typical pirate crew would have. So next we see her use her paint powers, called Color Trap, which aren't from a devil fruit by the way, to turn a pterodactyl into her friend with the yellow-green of friendship. They then use this pterodactyl to leave, where we even see Dory and Brogy again continuing their battle with their fists, because if you recall, their weapons got destroyed when sending the Mary through the goldfish. But then during Baroque Works' journey, it starts raining and the paint on the pterodactyl gets messed up, so they get dropped off on Vacation Island. But it turns out that there are Marines here looking for them, including the newly minted Marine Jango and his buddy Fullbody, who we obviously just saw in another cover story earlier. And much like Jango did, Baroque Works decides to wear disguises, which don't really work, and they get caught right away by Hina. But thanks to Mr. Five's abilities, he and Miss Goldenweek were able to get out of there, so Hina basically then uses Miss Valentine as bait by saying she'll be hanged that evening in the hopes it'll draw them all out. But then we see that Mr. 3 is also hiding on this island, and not just him, but so is Mr. 2, the goat himself. So then all of them get ready to help Miss Valentine, which starts off with Mr. 3 acting as the bait. Except it's not Mr. 3, it's Mr. 2, which creates basically a grudge match between Bon Clay and Hina, which builds off the one we saw in Alabasta. But sadly, Hina's powers yet again get the best of him, but it does allow his other friends to get out of there. Which is kind of on brand for Mr. 2, right? Bon Clay's entire character at this point is just sacrificing himself for his friends, and this is why he's one of the most beloved characters in the story. But then Miss Goldenweek commandeered a marine ship using her color trap Betrayal Black. And I think this is really important at this point, because we also saw this same paint used on Luffy and Little Garden. And I feel like there's definitely something to say here about how this could connect to something we've seen recently in Elbaf with the Domi Reversi powers. It's another betrayal-based thing, and even though Emu's version doesn't use paint, at least we think, it did all start by using yet another black circle. So I don't know what this all means, but I think there's definitely some kind of parallel going on there. But then what they decide to do is infiltrate the prison where their friends are kept, including the higher ranking members like Crocodile and Mr. One, or Miss Merry Christmas and Miss Doublefinger, and essentially we see that Baroque Works is reunited again. But Crocodile, surprisingly, says he doesn't want to escape. He says he doesn't feel like it. But he was fine with Luffy saving him from level 6 for some reason, and then after this, Miss Goldenweek does one of the most absurd things I've ever seen, especially in the cover stories, which is use a new color trap called Rainbow of Dreams. This creates a rainbow in the sky that turns everyone into whatever their dream is. Like Miss Goldenweek became a painter, as you would expect, including with an apple on her head like Vegapunk, which she still had during Vegapunk's message by the way, and Miss Merry Christmas became a princess, Mr. 4 became a pizza delivery guy, Lasso became a tank, you get the picture. They're all just wearing the right outfits that match what their dreams are. It kinda reminds me of Kinemon's powers, except not a devil fruit. But then we see Crocodile's over there in a Pirate King outfit, and he's disgusted by it. Why? Because he gave up on that dream long ago, probably sometime after losing to Whitebeard. What Oda is showing us here is that it's still his dream, he still wants to be Pirate King, he just doesn't believe that he can, which is a pretty stunning parallel, or inversion now I guess, to Buggy, who just recently claimed he wanted to go get the One Piece right to Crocodile's face. Both of them were kind of scared to admit it or to actually pursue that dream, but Buggy was finally brave enough to say it, which is why he's the captain of the Cross Guild, and Crocodile is one of his top subordinates. And then we also see Mr. One in a hero outfit here with a happy thought bubble, which is kind of funny given how stoic the guy is. And then we wrap this whole thing up by seeing the rest of Baroque Works at something called New Spider's Cafe, which is a spin-off of the original Spider's Cafe that we saw in Alabasta. And in the glimpse that we got of them during Vegapunk's message, it appears that they were still on a desert island, so I think they've probably been at the same place for the past 2 years. Oh, and we also get to see Mr. 0, 1, 2, and 3 getting sentenced to Impel Down as well. Next, we have a very short cover story sequence called Where Are They Now? That is basically a prototype for the Decks of the World cover story, which we get 2 versions of later on. And technically, this isn't a cover story arc like the others, as it follows a different format, and it's also broken up into 2 different sections, but they are still canon, and one page even made it into the anime, so I figured I'd cover them here as well. So first up, we get to see how our friends in Skypiea are doing, starting with Isa, Conus, Rocky, and Nola wandering through the forest together, probably for the first time without needing to worry about Enel zapping them. And then we get to see Wiper and Kamakiri, who are working to restore said forest. And then our last one in Skypiea is this shot of Gonfall and the Chief drinking pumpkin juice together while discussing a special pumpkin plan, which is something that we'll learn more about in a later cover story. But before we can get to the last 4 pages of the Where Are They Now series, Oda first decided to stick with the Skypiea theme by starting a whole separate cover story arc, which is probably the most famous one in all of One Piece, called Enel's Great Space Operations, where we see Enel actually make his way to the moon, aka the Fairy Verth. This is a cover story that to this day really surprises me that it never got animated. It's a pretty game-breaking story given that he went to freaking outer space, and he even met space pirates there, which makes it even crazier, but we'll get to that in a moment. But I do have a very big suspicion that when Enel returns, and that's a when, not an if, Toei will animate this cover story then, just as they did with Wapol, and Caribou, and some other characters. Because if they animated this back when the cover story actually happened, which was back during Thriller Bark, viewers would probably forget about some of it by the time that Enel actually showed up, which would require a recap anyway. So I guess Toei's just saving it so it can happen at the appropriate time, and in the highest quality possible, hopefully. But this one starts off with Enel, of course, making it to the moon on the Arc Maxim. He begins to look around and finds signs of life in the craters, so he heads down into one, where he finds a passed out army guy, who he electrocutes because, and I quote, "attack first, think later," which is very on brand for Enel if you ask me. But then the little soldier gets up, and we find out that his name is Junior Lieutenant Spacey, and he regrets running from the enemy. Now, who was that enemy? Well, you'll see in a second. Because first, he comes across his other fallen comrades, who are all wearing different types of outfits. You got the knight's armor, you got an outfit that would fit well at the Onigashima raid, and you got a different style military outfit. But then someone appears, a space pirate, who defeats Spacey right away. But he's unable to do anything to Enel because I guess this guy doesn't have hockey, so Enel takes care of him easily. But make sure you check out their Jolly Roger. See that tall head? That has to remind you of Vegapunk, right? I mean, who else could even get people up to the moon in the first place? But hold that thought for now, because we're gonna get back to that in a few pages. Because there's a big explosion, and Enel is not happy about this. So then we skip over to the rest of the space pirates who are talking over their excavation plan, and one of them seems to be the same race as the first guy that Enel fought, another seems to be a long-armed scientist guy of some sort, and I don't even know what to say about this last guy, except for this little gauge he's wearing. You'll see these other henchmen behind him also have those, as did the first guy that Enel beat, so I wonder if those are like pressurized spacesuits or something, or maybe a hint that all these guys are just robots, I'm not really sure. But it's just wild that they have this whole operation up here, right? I mean, look at all this machinery, and we can't forget this giant space whale in the back. I'm not sure what else to call this thing, but like, what the hell is this? And maybe the craziest part of this thing is that it's helping build or operate that machine back there, so I guess it's also pretty intelligent. And then we even see their ship, which is also pretty dope, but this then takes us into a flashback for Spacey and the other little guys that we met. And it starts off with them them being built, thus proving that they aren't human, and they were being built on Karakuri Island. Where have we heard that before? From Frankie's time skip, because that is the very same island that he visited, and more importantly, the one Vegapunk was born on. I feel like there has to be some kind of connection between Vegapunk and this old guy building the robots, who we find out is named Dr. Tsukimi. And Tsukimi means moon watching, which is pretty fitting since that's what he loves doing, but then he sees an explosion on the moon and chokes on a Kibidango and dies, just like that. So then his comrades set off for revenge by heading to the moon using balloons, where they were soundly defeated by the captain of the space pirates in that black cloak, who we saw right before this flashback started. I believe this implies that Dr. Tsukimi died rather recently, since the guy in the black coat is still up there, and the explosion that Dr. Tsukimi saw is probably just like the one that Enel saw, so I assume all the explosions are just their attempt to get inside the moon for something that you'll see very shortly. But Enel decides to do Enel things and cooks all the space pirates in no time, destroying pretty much their entire operation. And Spacey gets up to thank him, but Enel shocks him in return, which was completely uncalled for. But this then leads Enel into the ruins that the space pirates are excavating, where he finds an entire underground city. And again, for like the 5th time this cover story, Enel does Enel things and indiscriminately attacks the entire place, which actually turns the city back on. It even wakes up these dormant automata who are very, very similar to the 4 that we met earlier, and they all begin to thank him, including the original 4, because Enel shocking them woke them all up. Because remember, they are all robots, so Enel's attacks were actually beneficial to all of them, which explains how Spacey even got up at the very start of this cover story. But then we get the hieroglyphs, or the murals, the painting, whatever you prefer to call them. But we get 2 of them, which seem to depict what life was like back then in this civilization and what made them all leave. So first we learned that the moon people all had wings, and the image seems to be depicting these races building the automata that Enel just powered on. And keep an eye on this little orb at the top here, because in the next panel you can see it looks a lot different, as if it's turned off, which makes sense because in that panel we are learning that they ran out of resources, or they ran out of power. This explains why everything was dormant until Enel came by and electrocuted everything. And since they ran out of resources, the 3 sky races, the Shandorians, Skypians, and Birkins, had to come down to the blue planet, which is now the canon name for the One Piece Earth, by the way. And we also learned that the moon city was called Burka, which isn't the only Burka in the story, because we also had the Sky Island that went by the same name, which is not so coincidentally the island that Enel is from. And we know that among the 3 sky races who left, 2 of them made residence in the sky, and 1 made residence down on the blue sea. At least until Shandora was shot into the sky, of course. But then the cover story ends with Enel and his newfound automata army standing proud, ready to do something, which they haven't done in 2 years now, but surely when Enel does return, we're gonna see all these guys as well. And as I mentioned before, I do expect Enel's return to happen soon, likely during Elbaf, and hopefully we'll get to see this whole cover story animated when that happens. But from here we jump back into the Where Are They Now series with the 4 final pages, which is all about our friends from Water 7, starting off with Chimney, Kokoro, and the Yokozuna, who apparently doesn't challenge the Sea Train anymore. And then we see Iceberg having secretary audition since he is the mayor of Water 7. And a shot of this even made it into the anime via the paper, which I thought was kind of cool. And the winner of these auditions will get revealed in a later cover story, but the secretary actually went on to have a subtle role in Egghead of all things, which again just shows us that these cover stories do matter. Next we see Paulie running from his fans and debt collectors, which is then followed up by our final page of this cover story, where we see Oimon Kashi finally leaving Water 7 after being tricked into staying there for 50 years because they thought Dory and Brogy were in danger. And this page also matters because we learn later on that sometime after leaving Water 7, they went and picked up Dory and Brogy, which explains how they even made it back to Elbaf in the first place. But now that we finished up seeing people from Water 7, we of course have to follow that up with people from Enies Lobby, meaning that our next cover story arc is CP9's Independent Report, which follows CP CP9 after the events of Enies Lobby as they get pursued by the government. And no, this one was not animated either, but there is an important SBS that builds onto this story, which we'll talk about towards the end. But this cover story begins with Bluno using his Door fruit to whisk Lucci away from the aftermath of his defeat to Luffy. But then the whole group kinda realizes that they have to hurry up and save Lucci because he's still in pretty bad shape. And this is where we learn that CP9's actually being chased by the government for their failures, and they do what any former members of Galila would do and escape by walking on the C train's tracks, which you can see shaded in here. And this actually ends up taking them to St. Poplar to get Lucci taken care of, and St. Poplar is really cool because Water 7 buys a lot of their wood from there, including the Atom wood that was used for the Sunny. Because while that wood comes from the Atom tree, there has to be a broker somewhere, and they just reside in St. Poplar. But since CP9 was broke at the time, they had to earn money for Lucci's medical treatment, which led Kumadori to go do some kabuki stuff, Jabra and Bluno put on some kind of fire show, Kaku makes a giraffe slide, Califa cleans the town with her soap fruit, and at that point they finally earn enough money to get Lucci fixed up in chapter 501. And then we kinda get some slice of life stuff here, like Califa and Kumadori go shopping while the rest of the guys are kinda just hanging out, and I think this is pretty cool because it kinda humanizes CP9 a little bit, right? We were introduced to them as like a group of dangerous government assassins, but now they're acting like completely normal people, or almost like a pirate crew since they're on the run from the government as well. But then Lucci finally wakes up and Hattori's all excited in the window, and then he is discharged from the hospital, at which point they decide to go bowling of all things, with Califa throwing it way too hard. She's definitely getting kicked out. But before Jabra gets a turn, they realize that there's some commotion outside, and the reason for that commotion is that the Candy Pirates arrived. A group who only exists for a couple pages because they get demolished right away by CP9. Their group raids the ship and Lucci crushes the captain's skull, which basically makes CP9 the heroes at this point. And a young girl even brings them a flower as a thank you, which again, just humanizes them so much from how we met them originally. And I think it's extra interesting that Califa is the one reaching for it, because remember, Califa's younger sister, Alpha, treated Bonnie terribly even though she was an innocent child, which I think kind of exemplifies the idea that these agents will do horrible things if the government needs them to, but otherwise they're basically just normal people. But then they head out from St. Poplar and go back to what they call their homeland, which is actually Cypher Pole's training ground for orphaned children. We also learned a little bit more about this in SBS 109, where Oda explained that while there are rare cases when an agent's own children makes it into Cypher Pole, like such as Alpha and Califa with their father Lasky, the government mostly just uses orphans because having family ties can be exploited. And this connects to what we saw in Big Mom's flashback with Mother Carmel, who ran an orphanage as a front for a child trafficking ring, basically. So the fact that CP9 is so excited about being here is kinda bittersweet to me, because while I am happy they view this place positively and found some kind of belonging with the friends that they made here, it still is a training ground to turn orphans into brainwashed assassins. So I guess I just wish they could have met under better circumstances, I guess. And there is a pretty cool detail on this page where if you zoom all the way back into the tower in the back, you can actually see CP9 silhouettes watching over the kids' training, which is sort of a nice touch, I think. But then the Marine Captain Very Good sends his men after them, where we get this sick panel of CP9 all in silhouettes representing their animal themes. And the zones are pretty obvious, I think, but Fukuro up there is like an owl, Califa's like a sheep with her soap powers, and then Kumadori and Bluno are a lion and bull respectively due to their hair. And at this point we actually skip over to Spandam, of all people, who's getting treatment after getting his spine snapped by Robin. And I mean, if there's anyone in One Piece who actually deserved to die, it's probably him, but sadly it gets even worse later on, because Lucci actually calls Spandam because they defeated Captain Very Good and commandeered his ship. So then Spandam and Spandine basically think of a plan to take out CP9, while we see the group departing from their quote-unquote homeland, but not before they planted that flower they got from the little girl. This is such a great touch, I think, because they were obviously moved by the flower they got from her, and it really makes me wonder what Oda has planned for them in the future, because even in Egghead, we saw Stussy betray Cypher Pole, and with the way that Lucci and Kaku were treated like insects by their superiors, I wonder if they're going to fully defect later on, because we just got proof that they can be like normal people, but their duty to the government kinda keeps getting in the way. But with the way way that this cover story ended, I think it's a pretty fair question to ask, well, how did CP9 go from defeating Marines at the end of this to being in CP0 the next time we saw them in the post-time skip? And this is something that Oda also explained in SBS 109. So basically, CP9 disappeared and had their own time skip training arc after this last panel in the cover story, and during that time, Spandam got promoted to the head of CP0 thanks to his father Spandine, but then CP9 teamed up with Spandine to stop a criminal conspiracy by some underworld bigwigs and level 6 prisoners, which then earned them a spot in CP0. But then Spandine got sick, which made him lose a lot of his influence, which led to Lucci taking over as the head of CP0, where now he is Spandam's boss. Finally. But then our next cover story is the Straw Hats Separation serial, which showed us a little bit of information about what the Straw Hats were doing during the time skip. But we already had actual manga chapters about where they landed before this, and as I'm sure a lot of you remember, these were also animated, so the cover stories don't really provide a lot of new information, so we're gonna go pretty quickly here as I think most of you know this stuff. But the first chapter shows Sanji running away from Tibony on Kamabaka Kingdom, thus beginning his quote-unquote 2 years from hell, as the next thing we see is him wearing a dress. And this is really relevant because in chapter 635 during Fishman Island, we learned that all this running away from the Okama eventually gave Sanji Skywalk, as one day he had nowhere else to run and just took to the sky, which is honestly just so perfect for Sanji. But then we skip over to Robin on Tequila Wolf, which quickly jumps to the point where the revolutionaries show up, which is where we know Robin actually spent most of those 2 years. And then we get over to Frankie's section of this cover story, which starts with him running from more cyborg animals on Karakuri Island, and then finding the house where Dr. Vegapunk was born. Now, I don't know if this means like his actual birthplace, or if it's just where like Dr. Vegapunk was born, because that's where he did most of his work, but either way, it's pretty cool. And then we start Usopp's section of the cover story, which is called I'll Die If I'm on My Own Disease, which basically just shows us more about the Forest of Gluttony on the Bowen Archipelago, which we know Usopp had no issue helping himself to until the training finally started. And then we go over to Chopper's part of the cover story, where he's running from the villagers in the Torino Kingdom, until one of those giant birds that we met comes through, which basically just showed us that these groups were at war with each other. And then we get into probably what's the most interesting one for me, which is Nami's weather report. And the first chapter of this is called Business on the Legendary Sky Island with Area, because it seems like Haradas is selling something to people down in a desert country on the Blue Sea. And then we can also see a ship in the background floating upward using a flame inside of a bubble, which is like a play on hot air balloon, I think. But then the very next chapter shows Haradas making it rain for that desert country, which seems to imply he was selling access to it, which I'm not really sure how I feel about that, because in Alabasta we learned that when this happens you're really just taking rain from another island, like when they were using the dance powder, so I hope Haradas used a better method than that, but who knows. And then we get over to Brook's section of the cover story, where we see the long arm guys running away with the girl that Brook first saw when he landed on Hara Hitania, with this chapter titled The People Who Do Not Fight. And due to that, Brook decides to write a song while a dude is showing his boxers in the back, which seemed to encourage these guys to finally fight back, because in the manga, we heard one of these guys tell Brook that his music gave them the courage to finally do so, which really just fits into the theme we've always had about music driving emotions and the soul and things like that. And then we finish off with Zoro's part of the cover story, where he's standing near a giant cross acting as a gravestone with Perona floating in the back, and then a random shadow approaches, which we learn later is one of the human drills, those giant sword-wielding gorillas that Zoro fought during the time skip. And again, there wasn't a whole lot of new information here for this one, so we went kinda quick, but our next one will take a little bit longer, which is called From the Decks of the World, which is one of my favorites for sure, because we get to see reactions from the crew's family and friends around the world about the Straw Hats' return to the story, since this came right after they disappeared for 2 years in the time skip. And this is something Oda actually does again later after they get some bigger bounties from Dressrosa, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Oh, and these were not animated either in a normal sense, but they were kind of hinted at in the 4th Eye Catcher series, where we saw their bounties in a quick shot of their home. So we got a little something at least, although it conveyed very, very little detail. But what better place to start off than with one of the goats, Luffy's adoptive mother, Dedan. And not only is everyone everyone cheering in the back, but there's also this stack of Ace and Luffy books, which I think contain clippings of all their newspaper articles over the years, since we literally see Dogra over there cutting out parts of this edition of the paper. And from here on out in the cover story, you're gonna notice that everything's basically in chronological order in terms of when we met these people in the story, so it kind of acts as like a nice reminder of all the different people that we met throughout the journey thus far, meaning that next we get to see Rika, the girl who tried to feed Zoro when we met him in Shellstown, and we learned that she's basically training to be a waitress at the Marine base. And then this is followed up by Zoro's old master Koshiro reporting Zoro's return to Kuina at her grave, which I think is honestly just such a great moment. And then we skip over to Orangetown, where we see the mayor Boodle reading the paper in front of the grand opening of Shushu's giant new pet food shop. And this is the kind of random stuff that I just love to see in cover stories, because I'm sure many of you remember the destruction of Shushu's pet shop when we were in Orangetown, right? Where Shushu guarded it as a memento for his late owner Hawker. So seeing him get a giant new pet food store is just the kind of stuff I think we can all appreciate. Just like we can appreciate seeing my goat Gaimon again, who apparently met a girl in a barrel named Sarfunkel, which basically makes these two like a play on the music duo Simon and Garfunkel. It's just the names are kind of mix and matched. But then we skip over to Syrup Village, where we see the former Usopp pirates aged up about 2 years, which is then followed up by Kaya reading the paper, who's ignoring her trove of suitors in the background. Then we get to see our old buddies Johnny and Yosaku, and then we actually see Zeph reading the paper next, while the Baratier is undergoing some refurbishment. And we learned that they already did make one edition at least, which Patty is showing off, called the Docking Dessert Vessel Sister Anko, which is basically just a cool way to eat underwater for kind of a luxury experience, I suppose. But then we learned they actually built another ship called the Nasugashira, or the Docking Teppanyaki vessel, which Carne is showing us. And you can see here that Sanji's face is kind of off to the side of it, which is hilarious, because they also made sure to include this in Sanji's anime eye catcher that I mentioned, which actually that's the only eye catcher that had a cover story specific element included in it, which makes it like extra hilarious, because even the animation team isn't going to give Sanji a break. But then we skip over to Kokoyashi Village, where we see basically the entire gang having a somewhat sentimental moment by bringing the paper to Bellmare's grave to kind of report on Nami, just like we saw with Koshiro and Kuina, I think. But then it abruptly flips over to Ippon Matsu, the sword shop owner from Logtown, who put Zoro's face on a poster in his freaking bathtub so we can look at him when he's taking a shower, which is like super strange, I gotta be honest. But then this takes us over to one of the more well-known cover story images ever, I think, which is the mysterious man who's drinking sake with Crocus with Laboon in the background. Now, since Laboon is in it, this one was already legendary, but to make it even better, there were theories for years about who this guy was, with most theories pointing to Shiki because of the blonde hair and the striped cape, but due to what we've seen more recently in Elbaf, it instead seems that this is Scopper Gaban, which makes a lot of sense since he and Crocus were on the very same crew. But then we head over to Whiskey Peak, where we actually see the reactions of Miss Monday and Mr. Nine, who apparently had a kid together, which is just so random. But that means that next we're gonna go over to Little Garden, where we see that Dory and Brogy are still fighting. So then this takes us to Wapol, who's being crowned the new king of evil Black Drum Kingdom, and even being approved by the world nobles. So of course we have to follow that up with the actual Drum Kingdom, or what is now called the Sakura Kingdom, which shows Dalton and the Peace Unit, which apparently has enlisted the Lapins, who Luffy befriended during that arc. But then we also get to see Kureha and what are now called the Ishii 100, a substantial upgrade from the Ishii 20 that we saw Wapol controlling. And after Drum Kingdom, of course, comes Alabasta, where we get to see Koza, who is now the Environment Minister, reading the paper alongside his father Toto. And then we also get to see Igaram showing off this article as Pell and Shaka are fitted for their threads they wore to the Reverie. But of course, we couldn't leave Alabasta without seeing Vivi's reaction, who was walking through the city with the paper clenched behind her, likely trying to not make her excitement that obvious while she's in public. And we also get to see Vivi drop some food off to Cobra, who's on bed rest, which makes sense because the last time we saw him, he was stuck in a wheelchair before he met his unfortunate demise. And at this point, we skip over to Cricket and the Saruyama Alliance, who have set sail for an island called Necroa. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. There's a few spellings of it, but apparently what it means is Dreamland, because after they heard that the Sky Island actually existed, existed, then they thought anything was possible. But this is the only place we've ever heard of somewhere called Dreamland, so if you have any ideas where this might be going, let me know in the comments for sure, because I feel like there's something pretty important here, honestly. But we can't leave Jaya without seeing the South Bird, right? And we actually learned that a South Bird and a North Bird had some babies who ended up being a West Bird and an East Bird, who probably looks east the second most of anyone in the story, behind the one and only Monkey D. Dragon. But then we actually head up to Skypiea, where Amazon is selling tickets to Wagomu Land, which is basically an entire theme park built around Usopp giving them rubber bands for the first time. And this is where we get to see Isa, the girl who had crazy observation hockey during Skypiea, and Nola, the giant snake, who are employees here, actually. Nola's the biggest attraction because of the Nola bungee, which looks kind of dangerous, I'm not gonna lie. And even Conus and Rocky are shown again working at the Pumpkin Cafe, which is actually a really awesome detail from Oda, because pumpkins were introduced to Skypieans thanks to Noland, because he gave them to Calgara, then Shandora went into the sky, at which point the Skypieans took some of those pumpkins, and now even Gonfal's favorite food is pumpkin juice. So this scene is actually a lot deeper than you think. But then we skip over to Wiper, who's obviously grown his hair out quite a bit, and he's acting as one of the Defenders of God, which I take is basically an improved version of Enel's priests. But then we skip over to Gonfal and the Elder of the village, who are enjoying some pumpkin juice, like I just mentioned, but they also have the golden bell in the back, right next to what I think is God's house, since Wiper was standing right in front of that building just a chapter before that. And at this point, we head back down to the Blue Sea, to none other than Long Ring Longland, where we see Tanjit reading the paper with his grandchildren, who he was separated from for over 10 years while he was stuck on the stilts. And I'm pretty sure that's some old cheese that he's eating, because that was a gag that he did with the Straw Hats as well. And that means that next we head over to Water 7, where Chimney is now a station master, just like her grandma Kokoro, who we also learned is now getting to enjoy her day off. We also get to see the Square Sisters serving Lola and the Risky Brothers, actually, which is a really cool way to intertwine the people from those arcs, I think. And sticking with this Water 7 theme, we also get to see Iceberg and his genius 10-year-old secretary, who we later learned is named Alice. And she actually had an important role in Egghead as well, because during Vegapunk's announcement, even though it was nighttime in Water 7 when that happened, she was still able to wake up and get the video snails ready and summon everyone to the square quick enough to listen to it before even consulting Iceberg. Like, when he woke up, she already had it all figured out, so she really is kind of a genius, I guess. And next, we actually get to see Gally Law successfully complete the second sea train, called the Puffing Ice instead of the Puffing Tom, which I just love. And we also see some of the Frankie family, mainly Zombai, who started the Zombai Union to sell ships and cola to people. And at this point, we actually head over to Thriller Bark, where Perona returns to get her bear Kumasi, and I think this is kind of an important detail, because remember, we just saw the Rolling Pirates back in Water 7 who were on Thriller Bark the last time we saw them, so they must have abandoned that ship somewhere and then Perona went and found it, which makes a lot of sense because whenever we saw Mori at Hachinosu later, he had Thriller Bark. But then we head over to Sabaody, where slave trader Disco is down in the dumps, as he probably deserves to be, and then we head over to Impel Down, where we see that Hannibal was promoted to Chief Warden, even wearing a similar outfit to Magellan now, and Domino was promoted to Head Jailer. There's also a new demon guard called Mino Chihuahua, and we learn that Sadie has taken a liking to the new Vice Warden, who is Magellan. He and Hannibal basically just swap places. And continuing deeper into Impel Down, we next get to see the new queen of level 5.5, also known as New Kama Land, being the great Bon Clay, who apparently replaced Ivankov as the leader of this secret level after Morley carved it out many years ago. And speaking of Ivankov, we actually see his reaction next, followed by the last installment of this cover series, which is just the graves of Whitebeard and Ace with the newspaper pinned to Ace's grave, so he can kind of keep up with Luffy's adventures. So I know that one took a while compared to the others, but it's actually the longest cover story in terms of actual installments, and I just really love how we get so many different reactions from all the various people we've met, because there's not a whole lot of opportunity to see them otherwise. And speaking of long cover stories, our next one is almost just as long, which is Caribou's Kihihi in the New World. This one basically shows us how Caribou got from Fishman Island all the way to Wano, where we eventually found him in the Udon prison. And this cover story did get briefly animated in kind of a slideshow format that was shown right after we found Caribou again in Wano, and that was about 250 chapters after after this cover story happened, so it basically followed the same format that we saw earlier with Wapol, where the anime essentially saved the cover story until that character returned in the anime. So again, I really hope that that's their plan for Enel when he returns as well. But as for this one, it starts off back in Fishman Island, where we last saw Caribou, as he's trying to capture some mermaids, just like we saw with Shirahoshi not that long before. Until Jinbe comes in and clocks him, that is, at which point Jinbe packs him up into yet another barrel and sails off, until they run into Caribou's brother Caribou, which then causes Jinbe to just speed up and hurry away to Marine Branch G5, where he plans to drop Caribou off. And I think it's kind of awesome that Oda had Jinbe involved in this cover story, because the next one follows Jinbe after he left from this point, which is kind of cool. But as for Caribou, he is then found by Commodore Yarasugi, who plans to burn him at the stake, until Caribou arrives again. These guys are just crazy persistent, as you're also going to see later in this cover story, but Caribou and the gang then get to work and free Caribou, who decides to just steal their ship and escape on his own, which is honestly some nasty work, but he quickly gets caught in a storm, and then lands on an island that we later learned is one of Kaido's favorite islands. And we know that those mountains in the back are actually man-made, because we saw them half-built in a prior chapter with Drake in the time skip. But as for Caribou, he then gets taken in by an old lady named Babaru, who ends up being kinda central to the rest of this cover story, as you'll see soon. But then she feeds Caribou a meat pie to kinda replenish his energy, and then we see that while she's sleeping, Caribou decides to steal her valuables, which is pretty messed up, until she wakes up and sends him off to the harbor with an entire container of meat pies, because I guess that's her specialty. But as he heads out, some soldiers see him and call out for Commander Gabaru, who you'll learn a lot more about here in just a moment, but this causes the granny to run out and chase these guys away, and once again say goodbye to Caribou as he heads towards the harbor. But we see that along the way, Caribou has to kind of hide away from the search party, who is celebrating this return of the so-called Captain Gabaru, or the Child of Revolution. And we don't know that much about this guy outside of the context of this cover story, but since these uniforms look a lot like the freedom fighter uniforms that Dragon wore before starting the Revolutionary Army, and they do call this guy the Child of Revolution, I think there's some connection there. Like maybe Gabaru was in the freedom fighters with Dragon before he left to do his own thing. And I mean, this guy looks a lot like Caribou, so you'd have to think they're probably related. But at this point, Scotch comes in and squashes the so-called uprising while trying to make an example out of them, which causes Caribou to decide to run back to the old lady's house, showing that he actually does have a heart somewhere in that swampy mortal coil of his. And we also see that she left behind a picture of her grandson, who is actually this Captain Gabaru guy. And the frame does say Gabol here, but it's definitely the same guy. There's just like multiple spellings of the name in this cover story. But this kind of explains why she treated Caribou so well, right? And why she fed him those meat pies, since Gabaru loved them as well. It kind of feels like she's mistaking Caribou for him. So the old lady then begs Caribou to run away because Scotch shows up, and she actually stands in Scotch's way, which gives Caribou a chance to run. And I think that's kind of crazy, because this lady is hella durable, because she was almost dead when Caribou walked in, and she went flying when Scotch arrived, and she's still here kind of doing her thing. But then the next thing we see is Caribou running away like she told him to, until he finds his own crew who arrived on a marine ship that they stole. And this really illustrates their loyalty to each other, almost to a fault, because Caribou left their ass in the dust like a day before this, but here they still are. But then we get back over to Scotch, who's actually holding the old lady, ready to make an example out of her as well, until everyone looks over and spots the marine ship that we just talked about, and they see Caribou wearing a hat just like Gabaru's, which makes them all think that the guy is actually returned. So this starts a massive brawl between everyone, until Scotch gets caught in the swampy swamp and loses to Caribou. So Caribou then sinks the entire weapons factory that people were forced to work in, which again was definitely one of Kaido's factories since this is his island. So in some ways, Caribou kind of inadvertently helped us without really knowing before Wano even started, because messing up Kaido's supply chain and his weapons and all that stuff was kind of the the purpose of us stopping the Smile Factory in Dressrosa. But here's Caribou kind of doing the same thing just for this weapons factory, and I think that's kind of a cool connection. So then at this point, Caribou, or I guess I should say Gabaru, decides to celebrate. Except Drake shows up, who defeats Caribou no problem and drags him away. But we also see the old lady come back and give him one final meat pie before he's finally gone. And I kind of wonder if Luffy ended up eating one of these meat pies, because remember, Caribou did hook him up with a bunch of food a few times, and Luffy obviously loves meat, so I think that would be kind of a cool connection. But then at the end here, we see Caribou sailing away as the old lady fondly remembers Caribou's sacrifice. And then the final page of this cover story gives us the shocking reveal that the old lady knew he was actually Caribou all along, because Gabaru died. We see her visiting his grave. She just noticed how similar they looked and acted like it was her grandson anyway because she missed him so much. So I personally really hope we get to learn more about Gabaru sometime in the future. And like I mentioned earlier, our next cover story follows Jinbe, called The Solo Journey of Jinbe, Knight of the Sea, which basically just encompasses what Jinbe did between dropping Caribou off and then meeting up with us at Whole Cake Island. And no, this one was not animated either, which I find kinda crazy, because Jinbe did find a poneglyph during this one. But where this all begins is with Jinbe just casually sailing in his little ship pod thing until he comes across a lost sea kitten. But in order to get this kitten home, Jinbe visits the Sea Dog police officer, who then escorts them back to where the kitten is from. Except they come to find that the town has suddenly disappeared. There's only one house that was left intact, which was actually the kitten's house. And before we go any further, I think we gotta just recognize that at base value, it's really weird that there are ruins down here, right? Especially knowing that the world flooded in the past and everything. But in their pursuit of finding answers about what happened here, they come to find a shipwreck in progress, which causes Jinbe to jump in and save the day, because that's just what Jinbe does, at which point he's able to read the paper and learn about Law and Luffy's alliance. And I just love when Oda intertwines the ongoings of the world like this, because we can even see Doflamingo's face on the other side of the paper as well. So this also gives us a great idea of when this happened, because sometimes it's hard to tell if the cover stories are concurrent or not. But in that paper, Jinbe also learned about the sea monster crisis, at which point they head to a nearby port town, which has some ruins on it from where the sea kitten is from. And I think it's kind of important that a sea cat is being tied to this, because in Alabasta, we learned that the sea cat was like a sacred creature. People were forbidden from harming them, and even in the Tomb of Kings, which is where they kept the poneglyph, there were multiple statues carved in their likeness. And now that we have them tied to some special underwater ruins, it feels like Oda has some kind of story to tell with them beyond being a funny reversal of the idea of a catfish. But then Jinbe learns from the townspeople that the ruins suddenly fell on the town, creatures were destroying their ships, and that their offerings disappeared. At which point Jinbe heads over to this platform with Sea God written on the sign where they were leaving said offerings. And this is definitely something related to what we saw before Thriller Bark, where we found a barrel out at sea that was a tribute to the Sea God, which we tried opening but then set off a flare that really started the arc. And then suddenly another ruin falls from the sky, so Jinbe rushes into the water to figure out what's going on, and that's where he finds a huge mountain of offerings next to good old Wadatsumi, the giant monk, a character who played a massive role later on in Whole Cake when it came to saving the Sunny. And we learned that basically what's been happening in this part of the sea is that Wadatsumi took those offerings thinking that they were for him, and in return gave the humans a house by throwing ruins up into their city. So Jinbe has to lecture him about how obviously dangerous this was, because it's also what caused the sea beast to start acting up, which we learned about earlier. The sea beast lived in those ruins under the sea, and since their houses got stolen out of nowhere and then they saw the ruins on the mainland, they kind of assumed the humans did it, which is why they were attacking all their ships. So then everyone kind of makes up and addresses their misunderstandings. The sea kitten finds its mom, which is all fine and dandy. But then we get to the important part, which is where the townspeople bring this bad boy out, a poneglyph, which makes these ruins even more suspect, I think. Poneglyphs are typically only found in islands that are really important. Think back to Alabasta, Wano, Fishman Island, Skypiea. These poneglyphs weren't left with just anybody, right? So I think it means that this city was one that was friends with Joy Boy in the past, meaning that these ruins are really important, and with this added context, I think you could kind of argue that the sea beasts were maybe protecting this poneglyph, even if unknowingly. Maybe the sea beasts roam around these ruins like the sea kings roam around Fishman Island. But then we kind of see everyone settling in, and the sea beasts offer their services as shipping vessels to kind of make up for the ones they broke, so everyone decides to just have a giant party, because of course we have to end with a party, this is One Piece, and then Wadatsumi tells Jinbe that he wants to leave with him, which Jinbe allows, thus explaining how Wadatsumi even got to Whole Cake in the first place. And like I mentioned, he had a massive role in Whole Cake, we'd probably be cooked without him. So this is almost another example of kind of the butterfly effect of these cover stories. And when they're leaving, we also see Jinbe taking the poneglyph with him, so we can probably presume that one of the two regular poneglyphs Big Mom had in her throne room is that one, and since Brook got rubbings of all three of those poneglyphs, that means Robin's probably already read this one. So if you have any ideas on what information this one could hold, let me know down below, because I think Robin's gonna tell us eventually, but who knows when that'll be. And as for my guess, my money is that this one's gonna have the location of the ancient weapon Uranus on it, personally, because the poneglyph that had information on the god of the sea was up in the sky, so maybe the one with information on the god of the sky should be down in the sea. But our next cover story arc is the second iteration of From the Decks of the World, this time called the 500 Million Man arc, because it shows us reactions from people around the world about Luffy's 500 million berry bounty that he got after Dressrosa, as well as all the other crewmates obviously. And this one wasn't animated, but something interesting about this one is that it took place before all the kingdom's leaders left for the Reverie, meaning that it ran very concurrent with the story, because the Reverie only happened about 70 chapters after this one ended. But where this one starts off is with the news coups dropping the paper off to Tsurume, of all people, the Kraken that Luffy befriended in Fishman Island. Then we get to see Dedan, Whoop Slap, and the gang celebrating in Makino's bar, with Dedan even holding up Makino's kid, who many believe to be Shanks' child, although that hasn't been confirmed yet. Then we head back to Shimotsuki Village, where Koshiro is training all the young swordsmen in the dojo, who are all practicing 3 sword styles since they all probably look up to Zoro. Next we see Kaya and the Usopp pirates freaking out over Usopp's new bounty, or should I say God Usopp's, which was 200 million at the time, until we bounce over back to the Baratie, where they're all celebrating Sanji's new bounty, with Zeph saying he has lots of questions due to Sanji's heart eyes, but says at least he's healthy. Then we go back to Kokoyashi, with Genzo complaining, quote unquote, about Nami's new bounty poster, despite having a huge copy of it hung on the wall behind him. Then next we again have my goat, Laboon, celebrating happily with Crocus, who's reading the paper to him. And this has kind of made me wonder if Crocus has ever mentioned Brook being a part of the crew to him, or maybe showed him a picture of it, because Laboon does understand human speech, but I kind of hope and assume Crocus is keeping it a secret. So I guess Laboon is just excited about Luffy and stuff since he's friends with him too. But then this next one is kind of awesome, I think, where we see the Sakura Kingdom again, but the army has changed their helmets to include deer antlers to match Chopper. This is then followed up by Karoo and Vivi, who's looking off into the distance from her balcony, and since the title for this whole chapter was actually Take Me With You, it almost feels like Vivi is kind of longing to return to the crew, maybe even hyping up her potential return, which I think a lot of people are looking forward to happening soon since she is riding around with Morgans at the moment. And then we see the Water 7 gang all reacting to Frankie's poster, since it's just the Frankie Shogun now, as well as the revolutionaries who are still in Baltigo before it got ransacked by the Blackbeard pirates. And then next we head over to Baltimore with everyone Frankie met on Vegapunk's home island, and you can see the animals got some pretty interesting cyborg upgrades, I think. The gorilla has shoulders just like Frankie did in the post-time skip, and the lion has a metal mane that looks just like the Sunny's mane. And then we go back to the Torino Kingdom where Chopper visited, and you can see they opened up a Tanukichi drugstore, probably selling Chopper's medicine since his medicine bag is on the ground, which really does not help Chopper avoid the drug dealer allegations since we also saw him hook Beppo up as well recently with the Sulong stuff. Then we see that Brook's tour managers are angry apparently at Brook's success, followed up by Heracles, who says he's not going back to the Bowen archipelago yet. And this is not something I knew before doing this video, so now I'm wondering what Oda's planning with this guy. I mean, could he maybe arrive in Elbaf since it has giant creatures and he's flying on a giant creature right now? In fact, this thing kind of reminds me of the things that we found in Strong World, which Oda already said the Elbaf animals are a lot like those. Plus, with Heracles training Usopp and Elbaf supposedly being Usopp's arc, I think that would be a good place for him to show up. But after that page, we get another one that I think is pretty cool, which has the old guys from Witheria all dripped out, looking like new people almost, because Nami is also big into fashion. There was actually a short story about this in one of the One Piece heroine novels, where Nami participated in a fashion show. So I guess she just hooked them up as a thank you for teaching her about the weather. But then next we see Mihawk and Perona with the human drills, all wearing straw hats because they're quote-unquote tilling the field, so it's all like they're farmers. And I think this is because they eventually plant cacao trees for Perona, which we also learned about in the One Piece heroine novels. But then we see Kamabaka Queendom making preparations, which I think is in reference to the Revolutionary Army switching their base from Baltigo to there. But since that page with Dragon and Sabo on Baltigo was just a few pages before this, and it didn't seem that they had been attacked yet, it makes me feel like they were almost planning to move to Kamabaka even before Blackbeard attacked, which then makes me wonder if they were tipped off somehow, which explains how they knew beforehand, and then you'd have to ask how that would work. There's been a lot of theories about Kuzan maybe being a Revolutionary Army spy, or maybe Dragon just has so many connections that he's following Blackbeard's movements, kind of like Shanks said that he was. But either way, I do think this is a subtle hint that they already knew that the fight was going to happen. But next we go down to Fishman Island, where a lot of the kids are wearing the popular hero hats, which are just really replica straw hats, and then we see Rayleigh gambling on Sabaody while reading the paper, followed up by Marguerite showing Luffy's new poster to the animals he befriended on Ruskaina, which would then of course mean we have to see Boa next, who has a blown up version of Luffy's new bounty picture hung on the wall. And we actually see that this image is still there when Blackbeard attacked the island, which is a really nice touch. And this then leads us to Kuzan hanging out on a certain island, and I'm not sure we know what he was doing here just yet, or if we know what island it was, but this would have been between his Punk Hazard visit and when he went to Whole Cake, so hopefully we figure this out at some point as well. And then on a different certain island, a desert one apparently, we find the Red Hair Pirates, with Yasopp, Monster, Bonk Punch, and Building Snake all reacting to the poster. And why are they on this island? Well, that's because they're all there for a wedding, which we see in the next and final page of this cover story, because we also see Shanks holding up the paper. And as for what this wedding is all about, it's still a mystery to this day, but it's obviously gotta be incredibly important for all these guys to show up, right? But since it's a desert island, I think most people first think that it could be Alabasta, but for one thing, Vivi has tried very hard to avoid making it seem like she's friendly with pirates, so I don't think she would invite Shanks. Plus, Vivi would be the obvious candidate there to be getting married, which my agenda has always been she should marry Koza, but we learned on the way to the Reverie that she wasn't married yet. So I think this has to be a different island, and personally, I think it's the one that Miss Goldenweek and the rest of the Baroque work remnant set up shop on, because there's really only so many desert islands in the story, right? But now we're on to our next cover story, which is the stories of the self-proclaimed Straw Hat Grand Fleet, where we of course follow the events of those who joined the fleet after Dressrosa. And there are bits and pieces of these cover stories that made it into the anime as well, because some of these dudes even went on to the Reverie, but there is plenty of new stuff here as well. And we kick this one off by seeing the beautiful pirates, Cavendish's crew, setting sail while also waving the Straw Hat flag. And then we see Cavendish start daydreaming about the past, with the text saying, "As you know, all those years ago," which begins kind of a little Cavendish backstory, which shows us that he was so popular back home, women weren't even getting married, and this actually caused him to get exiled from his country, which is how his pirate career started. And that's why they aren't able to attack the ships that are following them, because they're basically just all of his fans. And then we switch over to the Barto Club, who's pulling up on a new island and attacking them right away, where Barto then jumps in and starts selling Straw Hat stickers and pins and other merchandise to all the people on the island, until he realizes that there's a red hair pirate flag hanging up because it's Shanks' territory. And this is where Barto decides to burn the flag down, which is the origin of that Shanks and Barto altercation that we saw in chapter 1126. And this was also brought up at the end of Wano because Shanks' crew couldn't let Barto get away with that level of disrespect. But then we skip over to the Happo Navy and Don Sai, who is my personal favorite Grand Fleet member by the way, who was met by his his then fiancée Uho-Licia, or Ook-Licia, a very muscular woman whose name is basically a play on the sound a gorilla makes, but this woman is actually very, very interesting because, for one thing, she has 25 other husbands, making her like a little big mom in some kind of way, and she is also the daughter of Chichi-Licia, who is the leader of the Niho Navy. And with Sai becoming the leader of the Happo Navy, their marriage was basically supposed to be an important political marriage, so that these two navies would work hand in hand. But since we saw Sai agree to marry Baby 5 during Dressrosa, that means he had to call the wedding off, so she decided to beat his ass. And we even saw Uho-Licia reacting to the earthquake from the Lucia during Egghead as well, which I think is kind of cool. But then Sai's portion of this cover story ends with Uho-Licia in the husband club, kinda lamenting over Sai's annulment, while Sai and Baby 5 finally have their wedding. Which then takes us over to Ideo's part of the cover story, who at this juncture was sailing with the XXX Gym Martial Arts Alliance in the ship that he got from Orlumbus after Dressrosa, as they come across two ships fighting at sea. So after they join in on the fighting, because they are the Martial Arts Alliance I guess, they come to find out that this is a battle between the Long Arms and the Long Legs, which is a feud that's been going on for 1,000 years. And obviously it's fitting that Oda had Ideo and Blue Gilly here since they are both from those tribes, except they're friends so they kinda counter that narrative, right? Which ends up mattering because their ships get damaged so they're all moored on this random island for a while, and what the Gym Martial Arts Alliance does is start working together and making a plan so they can use the undamaged parts from the other ships to repair theirs, but the Long Arm and Long Leg guys in the back just keep on arguing. And that leads to the next page where Ideo's group finally leaves, and he even tells them, make friends or kill each other, it's up to you. And personally, I think these guys are gonna start working together, so we're gonna see them again, but as one giant crew who works together, and that might be how we get introduced to the origins of this feud between them, because if it's 1,000 years old, that means it started before the Void Century. But then this sequence is followed up by the official formation of the Ideo Pirates, which not only includes Blue Gilly, but also Jeet and Abdullah from Dressrosa, who were former bounty hunters. And we actually see the formation of another pirate crew in the very next chapter, with the Tentata Pirates, thus beginning Leo's portion of the cover story. And this one starts by him ordering all of the Tentata to repair Dressrosa following the events of the arc, and they are quickly repaid by the people of Dressrosa with their own pirate ship that has the freaking Usopp face as the figurehead, which I think is just hilarious. And I also like all the plants on the side too, as it fits the botany theme with Usopp and Noland, who are obviously both close to the Tentata, so they promptly name the ship the Uso Land. But then the Tentata pirates learn that they are hired as security for Riku's trip to the Reverie, which we kind of already knew about because Leo did help crush Sharlos. But then we head over to Harudin's portion of the cover story, which is especially pertinent now that we're with him here in Elbaf, and it starts by showing us that he quit working for Buggy's delivery service. And then we basically get introduced to Harudin's crew through Buggy's escapee list, because they all quit working for him, and many of whom we've already seen again in Elbaf, starting with Stanson, who's the shipwright, then Rodo, the navigator, who's easily my least favorite of the group, then Goldberg, the cook, who has a homie shield named Nash, and then Gerd, the doctor, who kinda looks like her design could have been copied from Oda's original design for Nami. But then we head over to Orlumbus's portion of the cover story, which starts with the Yanta Maria fleet kinda just sailing around, until they eventually return to the Standing Kingdom, where Orlumbus resigns so he can become a pirate. And then we kinda get a montage of his daily schedule as a pirate, which starts with him folding clothes at 6 a.m., then a cleaning check at 10 a.m., and by the way, this was the same chapter where Emu was first seen, in case you ever get that question on a One Piece trivia night. Like, of all things, we have Orlumbus and Columbus on the cover, and by the way, Columbus seems to be Orlumbus's number 2. We don't know that for certain, but after Dressrosa, Orlumbus did tell Columbus to take charge, so it seems that's the case. And then they depart from their home island with the 56-ship fleet, which turns them into enemies of the Standing Kingdom, until 3 p.m. when Orlumbus fills out his planner with some more pirate activities. And then at 4 p.m. they launch their first attack. However, at 4:30 they realize that the island was actually really poor, so instead they help the island resupply. But then at 5 p.m. we see that he gets a hero send-off from this island, and he's thinking about how his pirate debut was such a failure. But I would argue it was a success, and so would Luffy, I think. It's not always about pillaging everyone that you find, sometimes it's the opposite and you want to help them, which Luffy has done many times. And speaking of which, we then see Bellamy's story, which kicks off with him visiting the village of Dyed Goods. And in this village he starts learning how to paint flags, and we see that he starts designing a straw hat flag as well. But the text for this page says there's an unbreakable fabric in this town, which I think is actually really interesting. Because for one thing, it fits into the theme that we learned in Drum Island about what attacking a flag might mean, and making it unbreakable would be some really cool symbolism, but also, like, what is this material made of? The first thing off the top of my head is that this fabric could be related to Viver cards, because those only disappear when the person dies, but who knows? If you guys have any ideas, let me know down below, because I really hope the Straw Hats get a flag like this eventually. But then we end this whole cover story with this little recap section about all the crews that are now a part of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. Overall, I thought this was a pretty solid cover story, and one that's already paid off some pretty big dividends. But our next cover story is Gang Bege's Oh My Family, which follows Bege's crew and family as they escape from the events of Whole Cake Island. And this one hasn't been animated either, but much like I said for Wapol and Caribou and hopefully Enel, I think we will get this one when either Bege or Lola re-enters the story, which could be rather soon because we still need to figure out why Lola turned Loki down at their wedding, and we are in Elbaf right now with Loki. And at the end of this cover story, Lola actually gets married to somebody else, but before we get there, let's start all the way back at the beginning, with Bege and the gang escaping on a tart ship, where Chiffon then proclaims that she wants to find Lola since both of them are now basically enemies of Big Mom, and with Bege being the good husband that he is, he obliges. So then they commandeer a better ship and head out for Thriller Bark, and you can even see the Florian Triangle on the map here, which is a nice touch because they still assume that Thriller Bark and Lola are still over there, which we know isn't true by this point, but they don't. So they head over to the Red Line so that they can get into the Paradise section of the Grand Line, but they run into a lot of the defenses that are there because of the ongoing reverie at the time, which is a really nice touch from a world building consistency perspective, because then this forces Bege's crew to stay in the New World portion of the Grand Line and head over to a random island to go get some food, where they then run into a musician named Tomatito, who is actually based on a real life musician named Tomatito, who was a Spanish flamenco guitarist, but this guy apparently knows Lola because he confused Chiffon for her, even asking if she finally got a husband. But after explaining that they're twins, he then tells her that Lola just left for Dressrosa a few days before that, probably arriving shortly after Luffy defeated Doflamingo. So the fire tank pirates get there and notice all the residual damage from Luffy's fight, and then they begin looking for Lola. And one of the first things they find are actually some dudes knocked out from being kissed by Queen, who Frankie kissed during Dressrosa, but then the Germ pirates show up, who apparently use Kiss Cooties, but Bege puts them down quickly anyway because he doesn't want to draw the Marines' attention. However, Chiffon gets found by the Marines at the salon anyway, and she wasn't found by just any Marines, but she was found by Prince Groose and Kujaku, and this was actually their first ever appearance in the story, even though we didn't learn their names, abilities, or affiliation with Sword until later. So Gotti then decides to run after her, but is quickly defeated by Prince Groose, and then we also see Bege's group is getting held down by the citizens actually, because of those Kiss Cooties from before, which apparently make them all want to kiss people. But Gotti somehow gets back up and keeps going and actually launches a solid counterattack and manages to save Chiffon, except it's not actually Chiffon, it's Lola, who then kisses him as a thank you, which is a bit of foreshadowing for later. And then we get to see Chiffon and Lola finally meet again after all these years, with both of them now being like runaways from Big Mom. And I think Oda having Lola get arrested while getting a haircut was kinda slick, because the way that you can tell Chiffon and Lola apart is their hairstyles, but since she was at the salon, her hair was undone at the time, so we weren't even able to tell that it was Lola until later. But then after this, we get to see the Risky brothers again, which is kinda cool, until we jump over to the Tentata sailing on the Uso land, who come across another tart ship with a familiar figure draped over the side, who we'll come back to in a second, because first Lola does what Lola does and proposes to Gotti. But soon after that, the Marines show up and they all decide to run away, at which point they run into the Tentata and the person they found, who is of course Pound, which means that Oven did not finish the job. And this fake out death was definitely a bit controversial because Oda does have a knack for doing these kind of things, but at this point, what can you do? He's got the will of P. But it does at least give us a touching moment here. But before I get to that, I just want to make sure you guys keep your eye on Pez throughout this, the baby with the 5 o'clock shadow and cigar binky. Because even when we were in Whole Cake, Pez would always react positively and excitedly to Pound, even when nobody else did. In fact, Pez even did a 180 from crying to being really excited just because he saw Pound, and then he was basically cheering him on when the oven scene happened. It makes it feel like Pez knew all along that Pound was really his grandpa, even when nobody else could tell. And Oda made sure to have Pez do the same thing throughout this, so just keep your eye on it. Starting with this scene here, where Pound finally reveals that he is actually Lola and Chiffon's father. Except nobody believes him, besides Pez probably, so they just hurry up and escape. But that doesn't deter Pound, because this Chad swims after them anyway, even with the cannons going off, which kinda proves how much he cares, and Pez is just loving it. And then Pound shows them this picture that he has of them as babies, and you can only see them like way in the back tucked in the bed since Big Mom was in the middle of kicking him out, which we did see the flashback for back in Whole Cake Island. But then this is finally convincing enough for Lola and Chiffon, who decide to bring him aboard, as Big Mom once told them that their dad was a man who never gave up no matter how many times he's kicked. And boom, the family is finally reunited. And then we get something that I alluded to towards the beginning, which is Lola finally getting married. I mean, after so many attempts, it was bound to finally happen. But I think this is going to be pretty important plot-wise because, like I said earlier, she was supposed to marry Loki originally, who fell in love with her at first sight and even turned down her twin sister Chiffon, but she turned him down at their wedding and we still don't know why. I think this is something that has to get touched on in Elbaf now that we're with Loki, and once he hears that Lola actually got married, he's probably going to start wondering what Gotti has that he doesn't. So I'm not sure if that means that Bege's crew could potentially show up in Elbaf so that Lola can actually meet him again, but at a bare minimum, I think Loki needs to learn about this and at least kind of reflect on it, which I do think he's going to be happy for her, but still, it could act as a nice segue for him to finally explain what happened that day. But as for the cover story, we do reach the final page here with Pound finally sailing off with his newfound family, and the cover story comes to a close. Which then brings us to our next and second to last cover story, Germa 66's Ah and Emotionless Excursion. This one mainly shows us the aftermath on Whole Cake Island after we got out of there, and while only a little bit of this one got animated, it was probably one of the coolest cover story adaptations of all time, with Kuzan and Augur pulling up on Cracker like that to kidnap Pudding. But before we get to that stuff, let's start at the top with the Kingdom of Germa making their escape from Whole Cake. And one of the first things we see is Judge sighing while alongside Ichiji and Reiju because Niji and Yonji got captured back in Chocolate Town inside one of Mont Door's books. This then leads to a mini flashback where we see them losing to Big Mom, presumably sometime after she had her wedding cake, and they even called her a creature beyond the power of science. And Pudding then walks over and punches them for bullying Sanji, which I think we can all agree that they deserved, and then Oven takes them through one of Brulee's mirrors over to Whole Cake Island, where Charlotte, Brownie, Anana, Kato, and Prim all plan to experiment on them, at least until two mysterious figures show up in Chocolate Town. Two people who Brulee assumes are members of Germa coming to rescue their family, which makes sense because in the next panel we see that operating room is on fire, which does free them from the books that they're stuck in, and that's because Ichiji and Reiju did show up. And then we get this sweet panel of the Germa siblings walking away from an explosion like you would see in the movies, but remember, those mysterious figures that we saw earlier were in Chocolate Town, and Germa's here on Whole Cake Island, which means we still have to figure that out, and we'll get back to that shortly. But for now, we come to find the one and only Gangster Gastino, who failed to escape earlier, come across the Germa siblings. At least that is until Katakuri and Oven arrive to stop them all. But Caesar quickly jumps in by using a poison gas attack, all so he can beg Germa for a chance to escape with them, which then leads to what is a pretty insane panel for the power scalers out there, I think, because Caesar's hallucination gas gets Katakuri and Oven to hit each other, which is really surprising given how invincible Katakuri felt during that arc and how not invincible Caesar felt, but I guess it is hallucination gas, so it messed with his observation hockey. So then Germa and Caesar get out of there together, which just leaves us to figure out who the other intruders were. And since Chocolate Town is frozen now, and so is Cracker, and Pudding got abducted, you guys probably know where this is going. Kuzan and Augur came at the perfect time to take exactly who they they needed. And those 3 panels, well, 4 if you count where we saw their shoes, are the entirety of Kuzan and Ager's portion of this cover story, yet the anime went so crazy with that scene and added so many cool moments. It's definitely the best cover story scene in the anime, I think, so I really hope they put that much effort into Enel's or any of the others in the future. But we then see the kingdom of Germa again sailing away, but with the rest of their family this time, as Caesar and Judge starts to fight each other since they still are technically rivals. And during this, they begin to reminisce over their days in MADS, when all the great scientists were in the same group. So first we see Dufeld, the Lone Shark King, who apparently funded MADS, the Laboratory of Peace, as a philanthropic endeavor. And we also get to see the MADS ship in the background, which I think looks quite a bit like the ship that Frankie repaired himself on after the Sea Train thing, so I really hope that theory comes true. But that's then followed up by the entire MADS group back in their heyday posing as if it's going to be their next album cover, until we skip over to the 3 bums of the group, Caesar, Queen, and Judge, who are mass-producing deadly weapons. And we even see that they're each holding an item that corresponds to what they were known for later. Like how Caesar made the Smile Fruits and he's holding some kind of prototype here, I think. Queen made the Ice Oni virus, and Judge had that electric spear thing. But what is Vegapunk creating during all of this? Well, instead of making weapons, he's winning the Ibel Peace Prize for developing the GP flower, one that blooms in gunpowder. And this is something that Hibari actually uses now to neutralize her enemies. I also believe that this is a callback to Hiryaluk, who wanted to make cherry blossoms bloom anywhere, because Vegapunk was able to do so even in something like gunpowder. And then we see those 3 bozos from earlier start fighting each other, while Vegapunk is off getting an audience with the freaking Gorosei, which likely kicked off all of his work with the world government. So after this little flashback ends, Caesar and Judge realize that it was Vegapunk's fault all along, which leads to the formation of Neo-MADS, meaning Caesar and Judge are now working together. And this is a plot line that has not been developed much further yet since this point, but it's definitely one that I'm looking forward to seeing what Oda does with it. And now we have finally made it to our last cover story, and the one that is still ongoing as we speak, which is Oni Child Yamato and the Holy Inari Shrine Pilgrimage. This is where Yamato basically starts living like Odin did and adventures around to all the different areas of Wano. And Yamato also said that by doing this, I'm bound to make it out to sea sooner or later, so this may or may not be a precursor to Yamato joining the crew. We'll just have to see. But where this cover story kicks off is with the sunken island of Onigashima. And after 40 pages of this cover story, we have not revisited this scene whatsoever, but I have high hopes that Oda will rope back to it eventually, maybe even when we learn about the fates of Kaido and Big Mom finally. But then we see Yamato start telling everyone what we already knew, which is that it's time to travel all over Wano like Odin. And this starts by telling Momonosuke, and then Kinemon, who also had a favor to ask, which is about returning Yasu's sword to Enma's shrine, and then we also see Hiyori and Otoko preparing a bento box as well. Then Otsuru gives Yamato some medicine and dumplings, and we even see Uroshima, the sumo wrestler, in the back, until it's time to visit the Yakuza, which is apparently led by Nekomamushi and Hyogoro now. And then finally, after 7 chapters, Yamato sets off outside the capital, until some kids start throwing some rocks because they still resent Kaido, and Yamato reminds them of him, which is a cool touch by Oda, I think, because it shows that resentment didn't vanish just because Kaido lost, which is something Wano has a lot of experience in, even going back to the persecution of the Kurozumi. But then Denjiro, who is the daimyo of Kibi now, puts a stop to all that, and I think it's way better that he did that than Yamato so the kids don't grow even more hateful, especially because in the next page, we see them all eating Odin together, which is something that Kozuki Odin also did when he was amassing his scabbards. And next, we see Yamato foil a kidnapping on the way to Kuri, until we find that Odin Castle is being rebuilt, except that Minotomo the carpenter is missing. The same carpenter that we saw Frankie with at the very start of the arc, and one who shares the very same name with a carpenter from the East Blue because they are related. Then we also learn that a local soba shop in Kuri is reporting some missing girls, meaning that we basically have a kidnapping mystery on our hands. And we see that Inuarashi is growing concerned about this in his new position as daimyo of Kuri. But then we skip over to Tama, who's having a ninja lesson in Amigasa Village with Shinobu, who has apparently reverted back to her pre-Green Bull self for some reason. And I think this is especially weird because we saw her 14 chapters before this looking like she did at the end of Wano. So I I tend to believe that this is actually just a mistake from Oda, which he does tend to make from time to time, meaning that he just forgot that she went on Ozempic, but we'll see. But then we see that someone steals Yasu's sword while they're all sleeping, and they start chasing after them. First, they come across Udon Castle, which is being rebuilt at the old prisoner mine, and then they find Hold'em, of all people, who's threatening Tama yet again. Except this time, she's able to win all on her own because she's gotten stronger from all her ninja training with Shinobu. And I think this is also proof that Tama's working hard on her promise to Luffy, which is that she will be strong enough to join his crew the next time they meet. But then Hold'em leads them to a mysterious base in Udon with a familiar figurehead at the top, so the group starts infiltrating, where they learn that this is Who's base. It seems that he kinda took advantage of the power vacuum left by Kaido's defeat and gained a bunch of new followers, where we even see him holding up Yasu's sword from earlier with two silhouettes in front of him, who end up being Ulti and Page 1. So Yamato jumps in and one-shots the guy with a Thunder Bagua, meaning that we freed all the kidnapped girls and Minatomo. And then Ulti asks to serve Yamato for saving their lives, which essentially makes Ulti and Page 1 like Yamato's own scabbards. Because remember, Oden also got his scabbards doing the very same thing that Yamato's doing right now, which is by helping people while on this Wano-wide pilgrimage. And then next we see Raizo, who is the daimyo of Udon now, who's saying thank you, until we jump over to Tama, who's entrusting Yamato with delivering the Amagasa hat to Kawamatsu, because if you recall, Tama is really good at making those kind of hats, which is also how Ace learned to make one for Little Oars Jr. Then this is followed up by Yamato finally returning Yasu's sword to Enma's shrine, which was kind of the original goal of this whole thing. And then Yamato wins a sumo match versus Sukune, who's Urashima's brother, because why not? Until we head over to Kawamatsu, who's the daimyo of Hakumai, which is Yasu's old region, who receives his Amigasa hat from Tama. This is then followed up by a visit to Kiku, the daimyo of Ringo, as well as Boss Cho, who's one of the former Yakuza bosses, who then directs everyone to the grave of a hero born in the West Blue and brought up in Ringo. A hero who died protecting the village from Kaido, leaving no trace of his body behind. A hero by the name of Kozuki Moria. Yes, apparently Moria is heralded as a hero in Wano. So who knows where Oda's gonna take this from here, but it is definitely a huge surprise, right? Because yes, we did know that Moria is from the West Blue, but we certainly didn't know that he was brought up in Ringo, and we also did know that Moria fought Kaido 23 years ago, but we also didn't know that he was revered by the people of Wano. So this is definitely something I want to get some answers to. Because I also think it's pretty interesting that they said his body just vanished, because that's something that also happened after Marineford. Doflamingo was sent to go kill Moria, but he just disappeared, and we later learned that that was because Absalom turned him invisible. So I kind of wonder if the same thing happened in Wano, although I doubt it would be Absalom because he would have only been 13 years old back then. But either way, we have a lot to figure out about that situation. And then as for the two latest pages for this cover story, we first see Yamato, Ulti, and Page 1 who are leaving the gravesite while eating apples, which is pretty cool since food used to be hard to come by in Wano, and specifically apples as we saw with Tama, but now they must be easier to find. And also, some people say there might be swirls on one of the apples in the bag, like it's a devil fruit potentially, but I think it's hard to tell. And then our last and most current page of this cover story shows Yamato overlooking the flower capital without the Straw Hat flag hanging in the background. Personally, I think this is another Oda mistake because he probably drew the flower capital without the flag so many times so he just forgot, or maybe it's in the laundry, we'll see. But now we are all caught up on all of the cover stories. And I want to thank you guys for making it this far, but I thought it would be fun to maybe spend a couple minutes talking about what the next cover story series could be. Because early on in the story, as we talked about at the beginning of the video, Oda was pretty consistent about following villains from the prior arc to give a little context on what happened to them before they re-entered the story, but lately he's actually flipped the script and instead followed allies from the prior arc instead. This started back with the Grand Fleet, then we had Bege, who even found Lola, and then Germa, who isn't really an ally per se, but at least we worked together in the arc that we were both there in, and then Yamato, of course. And since the last arc was Egghead, who would we follow from there? Well, I think the answer is obviously the Vegapunks, who went off to Weatheria. Perhaps we see them working with Haradas to improve their weather tech, since that is what he knows better than anything else, and maybe they'll even reminisce over some old times because they're probably already friends. They might find a new place for punk records, and maybe even ultimately head to Elbaf or something to reunite reunite with the Stella because he's supposed to get cloned eventually, but I think we might also follow Sentomaru and Stussy, both of whom are kind of MIA as of the end of Egghead. Sentomaru was last seen paddling away from the island, and who knows what Oda could get him involved in. And Stussy would be really interesting because the last we saw her, she was sort of contemplating her own fate since she betrayed CP0. And I'm not sure exactly what her reasoning's gonna be, but I think she's gonna end up meeting the original Stussy, being Miss Buckingham, who was last seen with Marco on Sphinx Island after Weevil was taken. This could be fun just to have the clones kind of talk and maybe shed some light on what it was like when the new Stussy was created, and maybe talk about their similarities or differences. And you know, Marco is still waiting for proof about Weevil being Whitebeard's son, which Bakken said VEGAPUNK could confirm. So this cover story could almost merge all of these different plot lines, and maybe have the VEGAPUNKs meet Stussy to tell Marco. Or maybe Stussy can just fill the gap and tell Marco herself, although she would have only been a few years old when Weevil was created, so it kind of depends on that situation. And maybe Sentomaru shows up too, so they all meet up. I don't know, who knows. But alright guys, now we have actually made it to the end of the video. And this has been the longest video I've ever done on the channel, so I appreciate you guys making it thus far. If you enjoyed it, a like and subscribe would go a very long way. And in case you do want to hear even more cover story talk, I did just do a tier list for cover stories on my second channel with Sai, so head over there and let us know how he did. But until next time, later.